From my point of view, I find, you know, as a therapist, the idea of vision is terribly, terribly important in all aspects of our life. John Powell, the psychologist, says that how we see a thing, or see the world, or see an event, or circumstance, or a person, in fact how we see God, will dictate our emotional response. So he says, you know, that this person he uses as an example, this fellow had a pathological fear of snakes. Like, he wasn't just afraid of snakes, he was pathologically, had this irrational fear of snakes. So he comes into his little wooded area this evening and just on dark, and there's this great snake across the grass, and he freezes. He thinks, I've got to get out, I've got to do something. So eventually just panics and in fury just cuts it up with a tomahawk into 100 pieces. And he goes inside and he exerts all the classical signs of fear. You know, he's trembling, he can't concentrate, he's sweating, he's unable to sleep. And so this goes on all night with all these classical signs of fear. In the morning he goes out to see what's happened, and what he's done is he's cut up the garden hose, which Powell then takes him back and says, what did you see last night? I saw this great snake. And what was your emotional response? All this fear, dreadful. What did you see this morning? Oh, I saw the garden hose cut up. What was your reaction? You know, a bit silly, I felt a bit stupid, put it in the bin before someone saw it and made me look silly. But there was no signs of fear at all. And he goes on to say, how we vision the world, how we vision a person, how we vision ourselves, how we vision God, will dictate then how I emotionally respond to it. For me to look at the church, I need to have a vision of what the church is. What's the church like? What does it look like on the ground? How am I part of that? And so for me, the really exciting and you know, wants me to get up in the morning and have a real crack at it is the beautiful vision of the church that Blessed John Paul II enunciated in a slightly vague or less, slightly obscure document. It was called Incarnationis Mysterium, which just means the mystery of the incarnation. And it was the document that launched the Great Jubilee of 2000. It was a wonderful document. But in it he says about the church a really beautiful thing. He says the church is in the world as the living presence of the love of God, leaning down to every human weakness in order to gather it into his merciful embrace. It's a beautiful vision of the church. And it's, you know, he says the church is in the world, not apart from the world, somewhere like hermetically sealed off from the world. And not as the living presence of God, but as the living presence of the love of God. Which, if people wanted to make a distinction, I mean, St. John says that God is love, but he's saying, make no mistake about this, that this is the living presence of the love of God, which has repercussions for us as a church. Are we seen as the living presence of the love of God? If we're not, why not? Reaching down to every human weakness. What for? To condemn it? No way. But to welcome that, to heal it, to embrace it, leaning down every human in order to gather it into his merciful embrace. It's a beautiful vision of I think myself, I look at it and I think, how many loving parents do I see doing that? You know, it's the great symbol of the loving parent. So I think that vision of the church to me is just so important, and that because in that we are obliged to recognise the innate sacred dignity of every human being, from conception till natural death. Every human being has this unique sacred dignity. Whether they be Catholics, atheists, whether they be black, white, whether they live in poverty or affluence, makes no difference really in the sense of how the church must view people. We must begin with that vision of the church of the scriptures, but certainly of John Paul II as well. And that includes people who are sick, I mean sick physically, you know, the plague of depression, the plague of people being unloved. So I think Mother Teresa said that the greatest sickness around the world was not physical, but that people felt unloved. So there is a sickness that comes from loneliness. There's a sickness that comes from being regarded as past or used by date. All of those things, I think that the church has to have a special role, a special approach, particularly in that whole area of health. But there are people that are dreadfully dispossessed as well. I find working, as I have most of my life as a bishop, with people in mandatory detention, I just cringe sometimes, you know, as an Australian, to think that so many of those people whose stories I know intimately have been so damaged, so dispossessed, so cruelly treated. I think that the church has to have something to say about that. Otherwise, where is this mind of Christ? Where is the touch of Jesus? Where is the heart of God reaching down every human weakness, if we're not having something to say about that? I think alienated people all around the world, but particularly not only from society, but from the church. You know, there's whole cohorts of people that are alienated from the church. And I think that we have to engage in a respectful dialogue with those people. And those people would cover people that, for Catholic people, you know, that people would often feel alienated from the church if they've had an abortion. They feel they can't any longer connect with the church, which is so sad, because John Paul, you know, made it clear that if we're to be serious about the right to life, he said you must firstly be serious about the mother who carries it. Walk closely with her and love her. So we must engage respectfully, it seems to me, with people who feel alienated from the church, people who are same-sex attracted. Where do they fit into the church? Where do they find joy in the church? Where is the heart of Jesus and the touch of Jesus in all of those places? They're great questions, and they, you know, I'm presently chair of the Bishop's Commission for Pastoral Life, and these are all things that I have a responsibility for, and I understand the difficulty of it. But because it's difficult, I think doesn't mean that we shouldn't be heavily engaged in all those things. It's the work of Jesus Christ. The vision of the church that John Paul II has given us, there are really no fringe people. In the parables with the Good Samaritan, the fringe person becomes front and centre. And I think in the vision of the church, for me, that the fringe people have to become front and centre. Other people can usually manage for themselves. But Jesus said, if you do it for the least of mine, or if you don't do it for the least of mine. I think it's easy in many ways, if in so many aspects of our social work and our society, to label people. And it seems to me that that's an enormously dangerous thing to do. Once we label people, we can dismiss them. And I just see in my own life as the Bishop of the Northern Territory, so many of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters sleeping, as we call them, in the long grass. In the vision of the church that I'd want to embrace, that the only label we can give to people, if we are serious about labelling them, is that they're brothers and sisters, that we're children of God. And by that very fact, we are brothers and sisters. Now, if we're desperate to label people, let's do that and begin there.